When you were Secretary of State, you had to deal with nuclear arms threats from Pakistan and North Korea. Did you wear special pins? Did you have bomb pins?
No, but when I went to North Korea, I actually, one of the stranger visits of all time, because we didn't have an ambassador there, and I wanted to make very clear that I was there with a purpose, and I wore a very, very large American flag.
And Kim Jong-il, did he notice?
Well, he did notice, but what I noticed, it was so, if you look at the picture of that, it's on that same crazy room where President Clinton was with the scenery of the rugs and the waves. And we had our first press conference, and I saw that Kim Jong-il and I were about the same size. And I knew I had on high heels, and I looked over, and so did he, and his hair was a great deal poofier than mine.
Were you surprised when North Korea freed Laura Ling and Yuna Lee, the two American journalists who had been sentenced to prison for illegally crossing into North Korea? Did it take somebody like Bill Clinton to do it? Did they need somebody who was
I think
that prestigious?
They did, and I gather that they made that very clear. And I think that it was an important visit, and I think that it began a process where the North Koreans, there's discussion now, the Chinese have been there in order to get them back into the multilateral talks.
A listener wants to know what you make of all the controversy over Sarah Palin's expensive wardrobe. Because she probably was given the same kind of advice that Jean Kirkpatrick gave you.
Possibly, but I bought my own clothes.
They weren't on loan, and
right.
And then you didn't just keep them.
Yeah, right.
The annual United Nations General Assembly debate concluded yesterday. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think any significant progress is achieved?
Well, I am a believer in the United Nations. It's an imperfect organization, but it is a place where countries can talk to each other and listen to each other. There is a certain, it's interesting, I teach, and I just had a discussion with my class about this, and as to what happens when you have somebody like Gaddafi or Ahmadinejad speak, or you have the same rights for some very small island nation. It does show that people are entitled to say and be listened to, and it does allow for interchange. The General Assembly session itself is only kind of a first act to what happens in the United Nations. The big meeting, and the important one, I think, was the one that President Obama chaired in the Security Council on nonproliferation.
Did you think it was appropriate for some delegates to walk out during Ahmadinejad's speech?
Well, you're right. I mean, if you are being insulted, you can walk out, and people can do that. They walk out of a number. It's kind of a symbol of not wanting to listen to tirades.
What about falling asleep during Muammar Gaddafi's speech?
Well, it's perfect. I don't know how anybody fell asleep. It was such a scene.
But it went on forever.
It did go on forever, and I do think that I was surprised by the fact that he did something like that, because I think he was beginning in some way to rehabilitate himself, and I think that he hurt himself and Libya, and I think it was a truly ridiculous scene.
This morning on Morning Edition, a former Bush administration diplomat said that he really thought that any direct negotiations, direct conversations with Iran would be fruitless because they just simply won't go along with anything. What are your feelings about that?
Well, I think it's worth trying, because part of what happens here is you cannot make a point saying we need you to do this or these are your responsibilities unless you talk to somebody. And the thing that I have found really quite short-sighted is when people say that talking is appeasement. It is not. You have to deliver tough messages. And the other part, I think we learned something, at least I hope we did, on the whole Iraq run-up. What happened was President Bush actually won a great victory in the Security Council when the inspectors were let back in. But he didn't run the game out, run the string out, so that if they refused, then we would have international legitimacy for taking stronger action. And I think that the Obama administration is being very smart in terms of gathering international support, trying to explain what is going on, giving the Iranians a chance to explain what they're doing, and then keeping their toolbox, their options open.
In 2006, you said that you feared Iraq would be the greatest disaster in American foreign policy, worse than Vietnam. You think that's true?
Well, I think that the unintended consequences of it are something that concern very much. First of all, I think that the war itself really did hurt America's reputation very badly. And you have the issues of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and how it is that America behaves. And I think President Obama and the administration is trying very hard to restore our image. But I also think that one of the unintended consequences is the question you asked before, and that is the rise of Iran. I think in many ways you could say that Iran has benefited the most from the war in Iraq, and it's hurt us very badly in the region. That doesn't mean that now there isn't some progress, but I do think it is a disaster.
Although Iran has been wounded, obviously, by the protests over the election outcome there, now people are saying that Afghanistan is going to be the next Vietnam. I guess every time the United States gets involved in that kind of war, we wind up with a comparison to Vietnam.
I don't think it's valid to compare everything to Vietnam. I think Vietnam was a horrible experience for the U.S., and Vietnam and quagmire become kind of synonymous. And I know, for instance, when we began to take action against what was happening in Kosovo, people would say it was another Vietnam. You can't Vietnam was a very special situation. I do think that we have to be careful about what the strategy for a war is, what the objectives are, knowing where we're going with it. But I don't compare things to Vietnam that much. I do think the reason I said Iraq was worse is because that had been such a searing experience for the U.S., and it was a long time ago, but I was really troubled by what the war in Iraq had done to America's reputation and those unintended consequences.